All right, so this is the first recording of a new podcast project, Two Hands Philosophy Podcast, which I've been planning for some time, maybe like a year or so. And I'm now very grateful to have found my first interlocutor, old-time friend, Theral. My name is Rodrigo, and let me describe what the podcast's intentions are, what my intentions are, and what I hope we can do. And then we'll just dive into it and see what happens. This is going to be an extended dialectical conversation, an extended philosophical dialectic conversation, meaning that we will, by way of argument and reading and examination of each other's thought over the course of weeks and months, try to arrive at some new knowledge, try to arrive at some new understanding in the model of the Platonic dialogues, but of course, in the model of academic philosophy generally. That means that we will be earnest in our expectations of the possibility of achieving something, though of course humble in knowing that if you come up with one new idea every few years, you've made some progress. So because we're not expecting to be creative with respect to the discipline in general, really the goal is to get to know each other. You and I have disagreed on a number of really key issues in philosophy, which I find very stimulating. And I think rather than merely have my own ideas, what I find interesting is to figure out why you have yours and how I can reach you, and vice versa. I hope that you can reach me. How does that sound?
Cool. Hello, I'm Theral.
And I'm Rodrigo. And you have a project independently of this. You want to say something about that?
Yeah. So I have a biology podcast. We've been focused on genomics, and I started podcasting. Well, I tell people before Amazon sold out of microphones or pajamas.
When was that?
We're going into our 14th season.
Damn.
So,
wow.
I started with a Plantronics headset from Radio Shack for $20, and back then you could get away with that.
I have to say, one of the pleasures of doing this podcast project with you first is that I don't need to worry about media training. If anything, you're going to be teaching me how this thing is done.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, we will get you a better mic, by the way. You're in Colombia, so you're on the road right now.
Well, I'm using my iPhone. I do have a good microphone at home, but that won't be until next week. All right. So what I want to do is first of all acknowledge that we come from a very different place. Well, not entirely different. I mean, we're both prone to scientistic tendencies. We are
Really?
both.
Jeez, I didn't know I
Well,
was.
I know you are.
I knew you were, but I didn't know I.
If anything, I think you are more than I am. But I take myself to be attempting to free myself from it, and so I guess you are too. So I guess we're similar in that respect as well. And we're both atheistic, and although we come from different religions, they're close enough by world standards. And we both have California background, or at least we passed through it. I'm still passing through. I tend not to stay.
Yeah.
Yes, and we both have a thing for wine. Although I'm really just trying to approach you. I think I'm at like 20% of your understanding and taste for wine, but I very much admire that about you.
Okay, well, that's an ongoing dialectic as well.
Oh yes, we should actually bring. I can think of 3 different books on the philosophy of wine. Maybe we can go through those if you're interested.
Oh, I think I know what you're talking about. One of them by Roger Scruton.
That's one.
Lovely
There's another one
book.
by Tim. There's another one by Tim Crane.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. And the third one I forget, but I'm pretty sure I have it somewhere in my shelves. Okay, so I'm going to go down the list of topics that we agreed in advance are likely to be at the intersection of our interests. And what that means is it's basically what we like to argue about. These are not in any particular order, but I'll start with social constructivism and metaphysical realism, roughly as opposing views to one another. I mean, I suppose I take myself to be a metaphysical realist, and I take you to be a social constructivist, and we'll try to figure out what those are, whether they really are opposed, and what we make of them. Another is more generally the philosophy of biology or the philosophy of science. Biology, of course, because that's where you are most of the time, and so you'll have a great deal to say about it. But it's interesting to me too, because I think biology has been underappreciated in the history of philosophy, really only getting started in a serious way, in my opinion, in the roughly 1980s.
Hmm.
There was, of course, some philosophical attention to biology in the German idealism period, but it's kind of holistic and mystical, organistic, and I don't much like it. Whereas the attention it has received in the last generation or so is more aligned with roughly the philosophy of physics and math and mind that we've seen at the core of 20th century Anglo-American philosophy. So I think philosophy of biology is in a way very fertile ground for new developments because it's not yet tired, in particular with respect to questions of normativity and the metaphysics of mind, in as much as metaphysics of mind typically asks about the relations between the psychological and physical facts, but it skips the biological middle layer. And maybe by looking at that middle layer, something more can be said.
Oh, okay. Interesting point. I would just add, while you're there, that in biology, in the field that I cover on my podcast, which the podcast, by the way, is called Mendel's Pod. They call this the century of biology. Now, of course they do, right? But I think that's right. I think you saw a great amount done in physics in the last century and chemistry, and you had the unification of physics and chemistry. But biology is still an incredible frontier, and so I wouldn't be surprised there's a lot of philosophy of biology.
Yes, I mean, I would agree. I would just say that that century began in the 1960s. Um,
Uh,
yeah. Anyway, so that's one or
is that
two
with
topics.
well, you had Watson and Crick
I'm thinking of the
Crick
grand
in
synthesis. Yeah.
1953, right, with
Oh,
their
well,
paper on the structure of DNA. That kind of
okay. I
kicked
meant,
a bunch off.
yes, I'm at the 50s then. I basically just meant the introduction of molecular biology and the grand synthesis in evolutionary theory.
Hmm.
So. Okay, so then there's specific to the philosophy of biology, there's the question of biological function and its relation to linguistic meaning. Those are some of the topics and particular philosophers that have been wanting to pay special attention to, and I think we might have some fun going there.
Hmm.
Then there's returning back to the philosophy of science, there is reductionism and its implications for metaphysics of mind. I'm hesitating to mention names because I just want to go through the topics first, but I know you know who I'm talking about. Uh, and then there's application of all of these to questions in sexuality and is it just sexuality? I guess that's sexuality is the only like applied topic that we have for philosophy of biology. I would add linguistic meaning, although that's not obvious to everybody.
What do you
And
mean
then
by
additional,
sexuality, by the way? Would you include gender in that? Because I think that's been a
um,
good question in recent years.
well, um,
By the way,
yes
I
and
don't think
no.
they're the same. I think sexuality is very different from gender.
Well,
Us
sure.
LGBT get lumped in one group for theoretical reasons,
Mhm.
but I don't think there's actually a lot that um, relates, say, a gay person to a transgender.
Well, let's just say this. I think that gender is distinct from sexuality insofar as social constructivism is true. But to the extent that something more like metaphysical realism is true, then they are not so distinct. So the question as to whether sexuality is entirely encompassed in the philosophy of biology, or whether it extends further into something like a constructivist metaphysics, which would then implicate social ontology and ethics, is really at a consequence of one of our core topics, namely social constructivism.
Yeah, true.
Okay. And then additionally, we're interested in liberalism, liberalism being roughly Mill and its downstream adherents. I said I wouldn't mention names, so I have to scratch Mill, although that one's obvious. And romanticism is something that we've both been very interested in. I'm not sure how you came to it, or rather, what it is that sustains your interest in it. Maybe you can tell me, but let me tell you first that to me, romanticism is deeply, deeply interesting to me, largely because it seems to be a an undercurrent or a counterforce to much of what I take for granted in the general course of philosophical dialectic. It seems to underwrite things such as modernism and a certain species of 20th century skepticism, and in our values and politics also seems to explain much of the discord and polarization. By the way, I don't really want this to be about politics. I don't want the discussion to be about, although I do believe that philosophical inquiry can inform us of why there is political discord, not just in general, but specifically what separates one side from the other in any particular polity, including ours. So, although I don't want to politicize or the philosophical conversation, or in any way relativize what we say to partisan perspectives, I do think that the examination of these questions will help us understand why we face the political questions that we do today. So that's where romanticism.
The reason the reason I enjoy political discussions, and I love having political discussion, and you and I have had our political discussions, and I get your point about, staying clear of, I mean, which election, who's running for what. But the reason I love politics is because it's really the application of philosophy. I mean,
it really is. Oh, I agree.
It's the intersection of philosophy and the real world. And so there's so many philosophical topics. I love to follow the Supreme Court because of this and their decisions.
I would actually enjoy taking some opinion and trying to distill the philosophical point of any disagreement between the the court's opinion and the dissenting opinion. I think that's an interesting exercise. It's not always very fruitful, but it can be easily.
Oh, that would be very fun.
Yeah.
And one of the core topics there, which I'd love to discuss with you. I don't know if we do it under the aegis of liberalism or what, but the modern theory of the court and the conservative theory, but it's become the theory, is originalism, right?
Oh, yes.
And this is a very philosophical question.
Oh, actually, I think it's an extremely philosophical question, extremely and a very central interest to myself, in that I'm very interested in the place of tradition, history, and inheritance in the nature of meaning and culture, and even genetics. So that I think falls under the category of biological function or function more generally, but that's maybe just betraying my particular take on these issues. But yeah, I agree that philosophical point that divides the court and jurisprudence generally is very fruitful, and I would very much like to go into it. And you don't hear much of it in philosophical circles, that is, in philosophy of language, and independently of texts that go into jurisprudence. And I wonder why that is. That I could be wrong about that, but well, I don't think I am. I've read a lot of philosophy of language, and I never hear anything that bears upon this debate. Though, of course, there's plenty written on the debate itself. Just getting through the end of the list, we also have an interest in metaphilosophy,
which is what we're doing
trivially. I don't know. Is it not quite yet? I think it's metaphilosophical. It's metaphilosophical. I mean, when you say that the application of philosophy of politics, yes, that's metaphilosophical for sure.
Well, I mean, going through all these political topics that we're interested in.
Oh no, I don't think no.
That's a kind of metaphilosophy.
No.
You don't think so?
No. By metaphilosophy, I mean doing philosophy on philosophy itself, which is trying to figure out what philosophy is and how to do it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So that would be the question of, such as, for example, is philosophy the study of ideas, or is it something more narrow than that, or broader than that? And what do we make of the people who think that there aren't any ideas independent of the mind? Are they even philosophers? That's metaphilosophy. Another question closely related to philosophy is skepticism. Skepticism is typically, of course, part of epistemology, But I think it has deep metaphilosophical consequences because if you can't know anything, then it's unclear what the philosophical project is all about. And then finally, religion. As you know, I hesitate to go deep into religion because once it veers into theology, the commitment to dialectic starts to wane. But I think if we develop a discipline with respect to all the other topics and then apply that discipline to religion, I think we can pull it off. And so those are our big topics.
Sounds fun.
So why don't we dive into one of them? Do you have any particular in mind that you'd like to start with?
Well, you were just with metaphilosophy. I mean, let's start right there. What is philosophy?
That's what I was going to pick too.
Okay. Well, the last time we talked, we got a bit hung up on this. And I really like so you and I are big fans of there's a series of videos that Brian McGee did. He was a
Yes,
British philosopher, but more of a journalist. I mean, he studied
that's right.
philosophy, then he became a journalist for the BBC. And he did a series of 15 shows in the 70s and 15 in the 80s with philosophers. And the very first show he did with Isaiah Berlin, attempting to tackle this problem, and they went all over the place, right? But the thing that stands out for me is when Isaiah Berlin said the purpose of philosophy is to uncover the new questions,
Huh,
to find the new questions,
that's
and
interesting.
once it does, it passes them off to science or other modes of knowledge creation, perhaps the arts in some ways. Um, but I always loved that.
It's so funny. First of all, let me just mention that all of those interviews are on YouTube. And since this is going on YouTube, I'll go ahead and link to them in the description. And in particular to that first one with Berlin. I didn't know that it was the first one. I'm glad to hear that because it may well be my favorite of the whole bunch. Um, Not only because I admire Berlin so much, since in truth, I admire almost everyone that he interviewed. It's kind of remarkable the names that he was able to collect for this series of interviews.
Oh, absolutely. AJ Ayers, Chomsky, all the current philosophers, and then they weren't only talking about their own philosophy. Like Chomsky was talking about his own philosophy because he had just come up with, the theory on linguistics. Um, but for instance, he had Bernard Williams
Mhm.
on. One of them was to discuss Descartes because Williams
That's
had
right.
written a book on Descartes.
By the way, that book is, when it was commissioned, assuming it was commissioned, I'm not sure how that works, but when he set out to write this book, it may have seemed to the outsider that it was just one more secondary text on Descartes in the way that the publishers might have one book for each of the classical thinkers and so on, and that he was just the one assigned to the task. But it turns out to be it turns out to be one of those cases where a secondary source becomes a primary source because
Hmm.
it is now cited for its own contribution, not in our understanding of Descartes alone, but in our understanding of, um,
Epistemology.
of more specifically of of the absolute versus relative dimension in epistemology.
Hmm.
So the idea of certainty and of absolute certainty and of absolute conceptions. I'm thinking here of Nagel's treatment of subjective versus objective truth. I'm not sure I can discourse on exactly what Bernard Williams said without review, but I remember it being very striking and noticing that everybody cites it. So it's a big deal. Uh, but you're right.
And by the way, this is our first show, so I might just say, because you'll probably never say it, that AJ Ayers is very influential in your study of philosophy.
Yeah, actually, his Language, Truth, and Logic was one of the more influential books in my youth. Although I follow Ayer to the end, in that when Ayer, as an older man, because he published that book in his 20s, when he was asked about that book as an older man, he said that he was very proud of that work and that he was altogether behind it, except for the things that he said about which he disagreed now entirely. So I follow.
Okay, I'm going to write that down and use that sometime on you. Okay.
Well, I mean, I follow Ayer in rejecting what he said. So, whereas I had my positivist, um, my affair with positivism when I was young, I grew out of it, and I grew out of it in time, and I can tell you why and how I grew out of it without going into the details. Quite simply, when I first discovered philosophy, I had a hard time deciding who I agreed with and whether it was even worth studying. That is, whether there was something of substance here that could compete with a more general literary and scientific education. In other
Hmm.
words, I got carried away with those who want us to believe that philosophy is bullshit. I kind of thought they might be right about that, especially given many of the undergraduates who had a philosophy major who I would meet and talk to. It really did seem like a waste, or at the very least misguided. And yet I had the bug in me, so I couldn't just set it down. So I kept searching, and eventually, and by the way, I had already been exposed to, in high school, I had already, and this is just on my own, looking around bookstores and recommendations from friends, I had already discovered Aristotle, uh, Russell, and Wittgenstein. So I had some good examples, especially the latter two. Aristotle's kind of remote and difficult to relate to if you recognize the tension between what he teaches or what he wrote and our scientific understanding. It could just seem obsolete. I don't think Aristotle is obsolete, but only because of the more subtle topics that he treats, such as in the prior analytics and stuff like that. But his biology, you know, um, is superseded, and so it was easy for me as a teenager to say, I can understand why some people become fixated on the past in the same way that we might treat scripture as deserving of our reverence and not our critical examination. But we live in the age of Galileo, not Aristotle, and our guides should be textbooks written within the last 20 or 30 years when at all possible. And Aristotle simply didn't impress. But Russell and
Okay,
Wittgenstein,
that's a little bit of presentism,
it is. I totally agree, but I
right?
was a teenager. I was a teenager. That's my
Hmm.
excuse. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, but despite that, Russell and Wittgenstein did impress me uh, without reservation. So I had good examples of how philosophy could be, but it was only those two, and I was in despair of finding others with whom I could discuss matters and be serious about it until I read Ayer. When I read Language, Truth, and Logic, I thought, okay, here's one other guy who thinks almost all philosophy is bullshit, but has a better way of doing it. And I thought, maybe if I just do it his way, it can be done. Little did I know that that attitude was at the heart of the positivist movement, the logical positivist movement of the 1920s. And
Hmm.
so what I ended up doing is teaching myself philosophy by focusing on that period and then moving forward until reaching the present at
Mm.
roughly 1 decade per year,
Mm.
or 1 or 2 years per decade. And it took me a while. And
That was
I
your
eventually,
entry.
that was my entry. The point is that I didn't enter with the books being written today, or, when I was young. I entered with the books written 2 generations before me. And then by the time I got to the present, I wasn't a positivist because, of course, positivism had been abandoned in the 50s and 60s, but that's where it came from. So yeah, Ayer
Interesting.
was very
Yeah.
influential. Yeah.
Lovely story. You know, for me to throw in there, I came to philosophy very late, and I'm embarrassed about it. Do give me a hard time.
Well, uh,
But I think it was
I
my
actually,
I think it was my biology podcast which led me to philosophy.
oh,
I read Plato and Aristotle in college, and I
yes.
was intrigued. Like you say, I mean, this was great stuff. But I was an English major, and we were reading it specifically for goals that our professors had. For instance, Aristotle has a book on poetry, right? Ars Poetica. But we read through bits of the Republic, and so why did I go for 20 years before really getting into it again? This is one of the big puzzles of my own life and questions. But I do think that biology led me to it. And basically, I had interviewed so many biologists, and then I went to a philosophy of biology conference, and I met John
Oh,
Dupre.
oh, you didn't tell me that you met him. That's cool.
Oh, okay. Yeah, who we're going to talk about at some point, right? Because um,
Was this
in
before or after I introduced you to John Dupre?
this was
Like the
before.
text.
This
Okay.
was before. Yeah, I mean, you introduced me to his paper on reductionism.
Uh-huh.
Um, but I went to Stanford. I have to give it to my business partner. She found this conference. We used to go to all kinds of conferences, so we just saw this as another biology conference, but it's philosophy of biology, and we're in there, and it got really interesting. It was just a 1 day conference. So I went up to
Yeah.
Dupre and asked him for an interview, and in the interview, he questioned. Well, his big thing is to question the metaphor we use in biology of the machine, right? Cell is machine,
Yes. Right.
organism is a machine, and he just points out that this is a metaphor. You
Yes.
know, the other thing is he was already questioning the idea of using the gene as a model for core model for biology.
Hmm.
Which was very stimulating. And it actually, I was really hungry for it because I felt like I'd kind of come to a wall in biology. And if I listened to the business people, of course, they were selling it, uh, like they were high on Kool-Aid. Um,
Hmm.
but when you talk to scientists, I could see they were struggling and that the insights from sequencing the human genome had not delivered like people thought.
Hmm.
And it was a crisis for me, because I think basically in college I became a materialist, and
Can
yeah,
you say
I
a
was.
little more about, can you say a little bit more about materialism? Like as opposed to what? As opposed to idealism or
Well, I didn't even know what the two were, right? But of course, materialism means that matter is all there is,
oh, okay.
right?
Yes.
Uh,
As opposed to, well, but actually that still doesn't quite, you mean as opposed to what else? Like spirits? Was this basically a move toward atheism
well, okay.
or?
So why did I notice I'd become a materialist? At once I started reading philosophy, which I joined your group, and
Uh-huh.
you introduced me to a lot of this stuff. Um, I That's when I started to realize I'd been a materialist because, basically, growing up religious, um, what I did was I discovered some metaphysics, or I recovered some metaphysics, and said, "Oh, okay, yeah, mathematics, numbers. I mean, these points can be debated, but I basically recovered some metaphysics for myself.
Hmm.
But I didn't go as far back as becoming superstitious like I was when I was religious, and that was
Okay.
liberating for me. That liberation from materialism was a huge point in my life.
To be liberated from materialism.
Hmm.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. So that's a topic we'll have to. I'm just going to add that to the list because I have many thoughts on materialism as well. Specifically, first of all, I I think we can conceive of materialism in two different ways. One as either as opposed to form in the form matter dichotomy from Aristotle,
Mm.
or um, or as a stand-in for, or rather, a traditional alternative to what we now would call physicalism. So, roughly, physicalism is just the idea or the position that the final ontology is coincident with whatever the physicists are talking about. So, all there
Mm.
really is space, time, fields, particles, mass, and energy, and whatever else they dream up, as long as it's uh, dreamt up in accordance with broadly the methodology of physics.
Oh, okay.
And,
So physicalism is saying that the physicists have the final say on what is on
well,
ontology.
that's a slightly stronger statement. I don't think we want to defer to physicists so much as agree with what they've done so far, and provisionally give them the delegated authority of establishing a scientific like an ontology by way of scientific realism. But it isn't because the scientists have the upper hand on ontological questions. I think that goes a little further. And by the way, I just recently came across a paper called, I forget what it was called, but it was on the topic of differentialism, roughly speaking, the idea that philosophers ought to defer to specialists in the sciences for any questions about which they have established consensus.
Oh,
I very much
interesting.
disagree with that. Sorry, what?
That's very interesting to me. I mean, we were just talking about John Dupre. I'm not sure actually he would agree with that. Although he learned a ton of biology in his undergraduate and graduate programs, and this is why he's so good on philosophy of biology, because he can rattle off, all the taxa and the species and
Mhm.
all the biological terms. But when you brought that up, what'd you call it? Differentialism?
Yeah,
Huh.
differential. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's specifically in the context of mathematics, actually, is where it came up in my reading. In that you may, for example, notice some philosophers of mathematics wanting to say that there aren't any numbers. This is called fictionalism, or some other species of nominalism. Of course, by this they don't mean that the mathematical truths, that is, what the mathematicians take to be the truths, aren't actually true. They really are, but they're not truths about abstract objects. But the mathematical consensus, that is the consensus among professional mathematicians, is that they really are talking about numbers. And so, according to differentialism, there ought to be no debate among philosophers as to whether there are numbers, and at most only a debate as to what it is that the mathematicians have already established and about which we must agree by deference. And the contrary view is that we don't defer to the mathematicians. They could all just be massively wrong about whether there are numbers, even if they're not wrong about which are the theorems of number theory.
Well, Dennett, um,
Hmm.
who, rest in peace. We lost him this year.
Hmm.
But his big, statement to young people, I guess, people who want to be philosophers, is learn a field, align yourself with the field, and then do philosophy. And he said to go out and just do philosophy these days, there it's you'll have a hard time. But if you specialize in a field, and of course he specialized in cognitive science, but I feel often that the cognitive science uh, gets in his way.
I agree on with both of you. Like he's obviously saying that as a kind of advice from personal experience. He often says that when he was at Oxford, uh, he just started, for whatever reason, he started to read psychology and some other sciences,
Hmm.
and decided that the methodology of the Oxonians was contrary to what the scientific results were evolving,
Hmm.
and that he was going to make his name in philosophy by representing the scientists in the philosophical discussion. And I think if you generalize that, it becomes the advice that he gave. And I don't think that's poor advice generalized. When you look at the history, the greatest philosophers all come from outside philosophy. Descartes and Russell come from math. Kant comes from astronomy, and so on.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
do think that's good. The problem is that today's professionalization uh, track encourages people being committed or devoted to philosophy from the very beginning, and so it presents challenges. But I still think the spirit of it can be maintained by reading widely within some discipline other than philosophy, if for no other reason than that much of philosophy is really a kind of review of other intellectual disciplines, as in the spirit of assessing interdisciplinary engagement. And I won't go for, let me, before I elaborate, rather than
Yeah.
elaborate on that, let's go back to the McGee, right? So McGee
Okay.
interviewed a number of great people. Let's list a few others that are just great. He interviewed R.M. Hare, Nussbaum, Searle on
Hold on. Oh,
Wittgenstein.
Nussbaum. Yeah. He
I should say
did get
Nussbaum
a
on
woman in there.
Aristotle.
That's nice.
Hmm.
Martha Nussbaum. By the way, I interviewed her brother-in-law. He's
Uh-huh.
a well-known biologist, Robert Nussbaum, in uh,
Okay.
in San Francisco. Uh, Look, that's a sidetrack, but he told me about many conversations with Martha Nussbaum. But yeah, Martha Nussbaum, her interview was about Aristotle.
Yes, yes. Well, at the time, I think she wasn't famous in her own right. I mean, her name was basically tied to Aristotle. But
Hmm.
since then, she's written amazing things on any number of topics and is a first-class philosopher in every respect. Another other names are, let's see, Sidney Morgenstern, I think was the name. Um,
Oh, I haven't heard that.
yeah, and who else? Putnam. He interviewed Putnam.
He interviewed
And
Putnam on philosophy of science. It's just a
that's right.
fantastic interview. I mean, well, of course, anything with Putnam, it's great.
Well, but that particular interview, I think, is one of my favorite expressions of why we should abandon the demarcation problem and the
Mm.
quest for a
Oh, the
scientific.
demarcation between what is science and what is not. He gets
That's
into
right.
that.
Yes, and the abandonment of scientific method. So it's a. I mean, there's more to be said on that, but I think as an intro to that topic, I think that interview is hard to beat. But returning to Berlin, unless you can think of other people he interviewed, the list I'm sure includes at least half a dozen other amazing names. I just can't remember off the top of my head.
Well, I
But
can remember the interviews and I can see them. Of course,
uh-huh.
Searle. He interviewed Searle. The first one was
uh,
on Wittgenstein, and then I think the second one was on his book, but I could be wrong. But yeah,
yes,
Searle comes on twice.
yes, there's that one. What he says about Wittgenstein is fantastic. I loved it. Uh, and oh, here's another one. He also interviewed Ronald Dworkin.
Oh
You
yeah,
expressed, yeah, you expressed
absolutely.
interest in jurisprudence. Well, Dworkin is one of the big names there. Um, what else? Oh, and Nozick. Uh, Nozick, I think, was also interviewed.
Hmm.
Okay, so on Berlin, it's funny that you should remember what he says about meta philosophy as you do, because I remember it very differently.
Hmm.
Uh, what I remember is not that philosophy is distinctive in its raising new questions, though no doubt it does do that, but rather that what's distinctive about philosophy, that is, what excludes um, the non-philosophical by some criteria, is that it is only a philosophical investigation that has as its subject matter not only the questions it poses, but the methods by which it seeks to answer them. So, by contrast with any scientific discipline, including mathematics, uh, physics, let us say, employs a certain methodology. There may be some vagueness or even lack of consensus as to what exactly that methodology is, but roughly it's um, following the example of Galileo, Newton, and Einstein and others, and uh, as opposed to the methodology of Aristotle. And and to the extent that one doesn't follow that methodology, one simply isn't a physicist. There isn't really any debate. Physicists don't worry themselves about showing the errors of astrology. They simply say that's not physics. I'm here contrasting to astronomy, of course, but astronomy being a kind of chapter of physics.
Hmm.
Similarly, with biology or psychology, whose methods will be more lax than those of physics, but also more constrained with respect to domain. So psychology will not be a way of studying the clouds or the mountains, and its methods will be broader because we want to have some results, but they will be narrow enough to exclude parapsychology and again astrology when it veers into personality characteristics. And again, it's not because they engage in arguments with parapsychology or astrology, but they just exclude it on methodological grounds. They say, you're just not doing psychology, we're done talking to you. Philosophy is
So
different.
yeah, so but you are trying to define philosophy based on how it's done,
No,
right? And comparing
no,
it to science, comparing it to physics. No?
no, not at all. First of
Oh,
all, I'm just
how
trying
did
to
I
repeat
miss that?
I'm just trying to repeat what Berlin said, although I do agree with him. And that is what's distinctive about philosophy is not its method. It's not that its method is different from that of physics and chemistry and psychology and the rest, but rather that it has no predefined method. That is, questions about what the method is just one more question in philosophy. To the extent that a method has been finalized so as to determine who is or is not a participant in that domain of inquiry, um, it's not philosophy anymore. It's now, you might say, a specialist discipline. I think philosophy is, and again, I'm trying to recapitulate what I learned from Berlin, though I agree. Philosophy is, I think, more than anything, a generalist discipline. It's about everything, but it's about everything in an all-inclusive way of being about everything.
I wholeheartedly agree with that. I wholeheartedly
There,
agree.
yeah, there are some other disciplines that are also about everything that are not philosophical. For example, poetry is about everything because you can write about everything. Uh, Politics is
Okay,
about
I'll go
everything
with that.
because yeah, politics is about everything because it governs every choice that we make about everything. Um, Mathematics is about everything because it's about structure that's universal everywhere. And physics is about everything. In as much as one is if one is a physicalist, then whatever physicists say applies to everything that there is. Of course, physics doesn't veer into the divine, but the atheist, the physicalist, will say that there is no such thing, and so it is about everything. So there are many disciplines that are about everything, but philosophy is the only discipline that is about everything that is also all-inclusive in its methodology because it has no prescribed methodology. In fact, trying to figure out what the proper methodology for saying something about everything is just one more question, namely a question in metaphilosophy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, that isn't to say that anything goes. I think philosophy is also um, something that can be understood humanistically. And here I would turn to an essay written by Bernard Williams, in which he says that unlike mathematics and physics, here I'm improvising. I have no idea if this is what he actually says, but roughly speaking, this is what I think I learned from reading from him. What he says is that unlike math and physics, where we can just read from the textbooks, lay out the arguments, simply agree or disagree about the premises, and to the extent that we do, review the steps in the argument to the conclusions and take it from there. Rather than do that, philosophy is also concerned with the history of ideas, because we have to figure out what it is that we're even trying to figure out in the first place by being anthropologists, archaeologists, historians, philologists, and none of that is susceptible to logical argumentation, or at least it isn't very fruitful to try to do anthropology with logical argumentation. That isn't to say one should be illogical, of course, but rather that logical argumentation won't get you very far. It's really more of like field work and collecting um, primary sources and trying to figure out what it is that they were talking about way back then. When we read Aristotle, of course, it's, I think, advisable, or at least I would recommend, going to the secondary literature first. In particular, you might want Nussbaum or Jonathan Lear or somebody like that. But after you do that, you should not be too sure that you really know what's going on until you read Aristotle. And in fact, if you want to be super serious about it, you might have to go to the Greek. And
Oh,
it's
I
not
love that
because,
you're saying that. I love that you're
well,
saying that.
I know you would, and let
Because
me just
you know
back
that's
off
what
because
I've
I don't
done over the
actually agree with
past.
what I'm saying.
Okay. Well, that's why I wanted to make for sure to highlight it.
Yes, I get it. I get it. No, I mean, look, I don't think you have to go to the Greek myself personally because others have. In other words, you can rely on the efforts of the classicists, people who basically, swim and breathe the Greek and think it's all been a decline since the death of Alexander. But you don't personally have to do it as well. I myself, for example, have learned, I don't know, 100 odd words in Greek that are of philosophical importance, but I'll never bother to learn the grammar and the ordinary
Telos.
words. Okay, so I know a little more because of, yeah, but the point is, the point is, I'm not going to bother to read Aristotle in the Greek original because the translations, for the most part, uh, get what I want, and for those cases where it's not so clear, I'll just learn the Greek word and take it from there. It's funny, actually, as I say this, I recognize myself saying the phrase "for the most part." That's one of Aristotle's favorite phrases. For the most part, okay, so it's a
Oh,
little.
okay. All right. Yeah, no,
but
I do think it would bring new insights to read it in the original language. But is it worth spending all that time learning that language when you can just read philosophy papers?
but
But
the question
speaking of
is,
McGee,
but what the
I'm a
question is, would
big
it
fan of
bring?
McGee. So McGee's language, other language was German, and he read Kant
Mm,
in the original.
mhm.
And he always had a fascination and a love of Kant and
Well,
Schopenhauer.
okay,
In
so
fact, he wrote a book on Schopenhauer This is, that
Oh,
was
really?
probably his most philosophical work.
Oh,
Yeah.
I didn't know that. That's interesting. So of course one gets more insights in learning from the reading from the original, but that's not the question. The question is whether one gets more philosophical insights. Insofar
Mm.
as not all insights are philosophical,
I,
you'll
I
always
think
get
you
a.
can get more philosophical insights. I really do. I work with my business partner
Mhm,
and roommate is native German speaker.
mhm.
And when I got into philosophy and I started bringing up mind, which, I just did because I just assumed everyone knew what I was talking about. She said, "What do you mean mind?"
Right.
And
Yeah. No, I get
she
it.
still sticks with this.
Yeah.
I think she's very positivistic.
Mhm.
But it's been a journey for her. She's actually been open, and she has several nights said, "Hey, can we just set aside this night for you to share what is mind?" Because in the German, they have Geist, right? But it can be
Yes.
translated to spirit. It doesn't. There's no direct translation to mind in German, and I find this
Yes.
absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. I I do too. However, um, I think philosophy is impoverished if what we do is follow what fascinates us. I mean, we're not chasing after glitter. We're trying to arrive at truths, and truths about languages are at best linguistics or philology. What we're interested in is in truths about well, mind, for example, or eudaimonia, not to be fixated on the English. I'm kind of on both sides of this issue, in that
Well,
I agree
well,
with Bernard. Let me finish.
yeah.
And that I agree with Bernard Williams that we can't escape the humanistic aspect of philosophy, but it
Oh,
should
can
not be
I write this
confused.
down? I'm gonna write this down and put
Well,
your
but
name.
if you only write down the first
We
half, you'll
we cannot
misrepresent me. So
deny humanistic.
let's get the first and second half spelled out before you write it down. You can't
Okay.
escape you can't escape the humanistic aspect of philosophy, but to the extent that it is an account, a historical account of ideas, you're not doing philosophy at all. So I think it's important not to lose sight of priority um, when appealing to resources, because the resources are interesting in their own right. So for example, by analogy, if you want to find the materials with which to build an iPhone, and then you just get interested in minerals and become uh, um, an expert and a geologist, well, you're not going to build an iPhone. You have to remember how you got there and why, assuming you're interested in having consistency of purpose. So, with respect to the word mind and German, I think German is a very interesting case because the German philosophy, basically from Kant to Nietzsche, uh, is self-consciously is self-consciously of self-consciously does not use the standard Latin and Greek terminology used in French and English. In French and English, we don't use very many words that are unique to those languages. Instead we just take the borrowed words from Greek and Latin, especially Latin. Mind, for example, is just from mente, which is Latin, right? It's not uniquely English. Um,
Mm.
but Germans don't do that
Yeah,
for
I
whatever
that was
reason.
the first thing I brought up. Because I
Yeah.
did have some Latin,
Mhm.
and she did too in school.
Yeah. But
So
for
that's
whatever reason,
become
the
a kind of
Germans.
unification for us,
Mhm.
or a place to meet.
So for whatever reason, Germans didn't do that. Even though they're perfectly aware of the Latin and Greek words, they very much, for whatever reason, wanted to write philosophy in their own language, as in
Vernacular. Oh,
yeah, yeah.
interesting. It's
But there's more
interesting.
than that.
So, are you saying
It's more than that.
this is
Oh, hold on.
striking about German
It's
philosophy? Um,
it's more than that. It's not just vernacular, because English and French are also vernacular languages, but we use the cognates of the words that were, for example, we talked about in philosophy of mind, we talked about intentionality. Well, intentio was used when philosophy was done in Latin 1,500 years ago. So there's a continuity even
mm,
before the English language came on the scene. But
mm,
in German, they use the word Geist, which has no cognate in Greek or
mm.
Latin or French. We of course have it in English as ghost, but the word ghost doesn't get used in philosophy. So you have to engage in this translation project, and I think we make a mistake in supposing that there's great wisdom to be found in translation efforts. But we have to do it anyway, because without it, we cut ourselves off from entire schools of thought. So I do think it's important to be mindful, no pun intended, we're mindful about what the word mind means. Like, what is the relationship between mind, spirit, intellect, understanding, now going into the Greek and Latin, nous, psyche, soul, spirit. These words
Mens,
are,
mentis.
well, that's easy. That's just mind.
That's the Latin. Yeah.
Yeah. And so these are interesting questions, but are they philosophical questions? I think they're really more etymological and historical questions. And we have to be historians so that we don't get caught up in pointless verbal disputes. But if we overdo it, we become historians and forget the philosophy.
Okay, so let me see if I can put a little bit of a mirror up to you there. You seem to be revealing yourself as a Platonist here.
Well,
that it doesn't matter which language, right?
Okay.
But the other thing, you're saying I actually get, and I have, it's why I've tried to explain mine to her. Because I think these things have kind of well, I tend to be a Platonist too. That there are ideals and core concepts here. And
Yeah.
okay, your language doesn't have a word for it. Well, now they ought to, And then she admits, well, we use the English word mind.
Oh, interesting.
You know,
Interesting.
But then the other thing that you said about German philosophy, I'd not considered this, sort of a dogged insistence on coming up with their own terms. Of course, this leads to Heidegger with his Dasein.
Yeah,
I
well,
mean,
it
this
doesn't
is a
start with him.
neologism, but it probably comes from that same spirit of German philosophy
I think so.
Yeah,
I
going with
think
their
so.
own language.
But it goes way back. I mean, Kant, for example, makes a distinction between Vernunft and Verstand, right? Verstand is our understanding, which is German, not Latin or Greek. And Vernunft, I don't even know if we have that in English. Whereas in English, we use the word truth. I guess truth is not Latin or Greek, but we take it as synonymous with veritas, which is Latin. And understanding, I don't think, plays a very strong role in epistemology or philosophy of science. So we don't. So what was when I hear Kant make a distinction between reason and understanding, I find myself completely mystified, because it seems to me that if you understand something, you've got reason for what you believe, and you know it. But in his philosophy, there is a distinction there, and in Hegel's, it's even more pronounced, and that becomes a a twofold project. It's either a translation project, assuming that distinction can be revealed by the proper translation, or it becomes a project in the interpretation of Kant or Hegel or whoever it is that you're trying to understand, without concern for the particular terminology used. In fact, you can just leave the terms untranslated, which is my preference when there's any suspicion that the translation might fail. For instance, when I read Hegel, I don't say spirit. I say Geist. I mean, I might say spirit in practice, but I prefer to think about it in the German. And similarly, when I read Plato, I don't think of knowledge. I think of episteme, because episteme is not exactly the same thing as knowledge.
That's cool.
He says,
that's cool. Yeah.
Because episteme is only of the forms, but I can know where I parked my car. That's not knowledge of a form. So it's best, I think, to leave things untranslated in some cases and not worry about exactly how to map all of these terms to each other.
Yeah. Okay. So we went a bit down a rabbit hole there, but it does lead to, I think there's a core conflict in philosophy. This brings up a core conflict in philosophy, which I've been thinking about lately, which would be essentialism versus historicism.
Okay.
And I don't know where that fits in our list, and we do want to talk about our list and where we're going. But
Actually, I'll tell you exactly where it fits in. It's at the top because I just added it.
Okay, but this seems to be two different directions. I find myself personally struggling between these two.
Mhm. It's interesting. I want to be really, really clear that a humanistic approach to philosophy is not a historicist approach. It is possible to be one without being the other, though
Hmm.
for many, any attending to history is historicist. So that's maybe something to consider. Similarly, it is possible
Well,
to
well,
be
oh, sorry, go ahead. But I think,
similarly well,
yeah.
just similarly, it is possible to be anti-historicist, but not be an essentialist. So there's really four options here: not essentialism versus historicism, but essentialism, anti-essentialism, historicism, and anti-historicism.
Okay, and what do you think is the relationship between historicism and essentialism?
Oh, mainly just that historicists don't like essentialism. So basically, that combination maybe isn't held by anybody, but the other three options are available.
Uh, yeah, I mean, I think it's a fundamental question about reality. It's a fundamental
Yes,
ontological question, you know.
yes.
Yeah, this gets us into metaphysical realism, basically, because does reality change based on history, or is it the same?
Yeah, yeah.
And so
I'm
this was the
actually,
question when we were talking about German, and languages. Um,
mhm.
um, yeah, if there are essential ideas, and it's just up to the language to figure that out, or do the ideas literally come from the language, from the accident of history?
Yes, uh, very deep, and we should go into that. Let me just say briefly what I think about this. In general, I oppose historicism on on the on most
On
of the
Epicurean
questions.
grounds.
What does that mean?
I'm just being silly. I'm just
Oh, well, I didn't even get the joke, but I oppose historicism on on um, on 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 the greater part of the philosophical questions in the tradition, such as what is knowledge, what is mind, but I and truth generally. But I do think that on some, with respect to some ideas, such as what it is to be human, or the meanings of words, or uh, moral truths, I think there is room for a historical uh, dimension to their reality, which is not the same as to say that that I support a kind of conceptualism by which these ideas come into play because we think that they are so. In other words, I can see a place for a historical contribution or constituent to the ontology of, let's say, humanity without being a constructivist or a conceptualist, because it can be not merely a cultural history, but a biological history, a natural history. Yeah. So that's my view on that.
Oh,
And
interesting you
essentially,
said natural history, because I think historicism is more the naturalist route. If you want
is
to
what
naturalize something, historicism is more the naturalist route. If you want to, really, historicism is the direction science has gone. You know,
oh, that's I don't
Darwin.
yeah that
Uh,
seems to me to be exactly the opposite of the truth. It seems to me that naturalism and historicism are diametrically opposed.
oh, okay.
Uh, yeah,
Interesting. Yeah.
that's
So
something to
look,
explore.
yeah, we won't go too deep into this.
No,
We'll save
I
it.
mean we will, but not today. So on the philosophy of biology and science, what do you think of the demarcation problem? Do you think it's is dead the way I do, or do you think we should still be asking what qualifies as pseudoscience?
Well, when you say demarcation, you mean between science and not science, not between physics and biology,
That's right.
correct?
It's roughly between science and pseudoscience. In other words, genuine science and mere pretenders.
I'm with Putnam on this. He says so I'm uh yeah, I'm in the direction that that anyone could do science. Mendel, who we named our podcast after, was a monk of all things to be a scientist, right? And he went out in his back garden and grew peas. Now he obviously had some kind of training. He did a lot of great statistics. I mean, his recording of this, and he was ambitious to get published.
Uh-huh.
And so he did publish, even though it wasn't noticed for 30 years or 40. So I think he's engaging in the scientific world when he publishes, but there's so many things about his life which is just amateur.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure that's what Putnam's point was. I think what he meant to say is that there isn't any methodology unique to science. So it's not just that anybody can be a scientist, but that even people who aren't scientists, or rather, even people who aren't doing science, like say a private detective trying to find out who committed the murder, they aren't employing a methodology all that distinct from that of scientists.
I see. So you're saying that he doesn't think the methodology is distinct, but he
Right.
does think that scientists are distinct from non-scientists.
No, actually, I mean, I think what he settles on, in fact, it's what he explicitly says, is that ultimately we just call science the successful knowledge producing enterprises.
Yeah, which is pretty general, right?
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, basically, astrology is scientific to the extent that it's successful. And the reason we don't
uh-huh.
consider it science is because it isn't successful.
Uh-huh. Yeah. I didn't remember that, but I think that's right. I think that's cool. You know what I go to a question on I love to ask this question of people. I like to ask it of lay people, not just scientists. Um, but um I'll put the question. I remember I ran and I was having dinner in San Mateo one night and just talked to the person next to me and we got talking about these topics and I asked him, do you think that all knowledge is science knowledge? And he said yes. Okay. And I remember the dessert was being served then, and it was a creme brulee. And I said, so you think knowledge of how to cook this creme brulee is science knowledge versus cuisine knowledge or chef knowledge? And he said, yes, because he has to figure out how hot to burn the top and how to, handle the eggs and blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, that couldn't be knowledge that's just passed on from maybe his mother or father. That's just cooking knowledge or that he learned in cooking school. And he says, well, ultimately, all knowledge will be science knowledge. I fundamentally disagree with that. I think there is a tradition of knowledge for humans that's not science.
I tend to agree with you. Um, however, hmm, yeah, I generally agree with you. Let me ask you another question about philosophy of science that maybe yields more direct disagreement. What do you think of the question of scientific realism? Do you suppose that science is largely about predicting and controlling our experience, or is it about discerning the ultimate reality behind the appearances?
Hmm. Hmm. Great question.
So
I
to
think
put it yet
most
another way,
scientists today are in the predictive camp,
well, but I'm
particularly
not asking them.
biologists.
I'm asking you.
Okay.
Let me ask it a different way. Do you think that science limits itself to questions of correlation and and mathematical modeling uh, and and um, and phenomenal uh, observables, or is it also about the discernment of essences, causal relations, and and um, and necessary truths?
All of the above. It is all of the above.
Okay, well then
Yeah.
you're a realist, and so am I. So we might not.
But when you say scientific realism, I tend to think of scientific realism as similar um, to naive realism. The scientists assume that the world they're looking at when they do their experiments, the bacteria, the fruit flies, is just exists the way a
Mhm.
naive realist does. and they're not really too concerned with that. They're more concerned with what it does, what happens when you mix this and this and this chemical in there, or try this drug on this
Mhm.
population of humans. Um, so I do think scientific realism is very similar to naive realism, and I think this is, to go back to where we started. I think this was the wall that I ran into.
Oh,
It was
interesting.
failing. It was failing. The scientific realism was failing, and we needed new ideas in biology. We needed new concepts, and I
Mhm.
think they're coming from philosophy. I think they always do.
Mhm.
But I'm starting a new series this summer called The New Biology, and the first guy I'm interviewing, Mike Levin, is very, very
Mm.
philosophical, and he's basically using new models. He's moving on from the genome
Mhm.
to other models, networks of cells, for instance. And it's gutsy, it's bold. I think the guy has to have, incredible guts to do this, because the NIH has just been funding genomics nonstop,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Now, is he being kind of phenomenological or essential? I I think science needs to look at what's going on. They need to be phenomenological, but at times they need to return to essentialism to find new ways and new questions.
I don't really have any opinion as to whether Levin's bold new direction requires any particular philosophical commitments. I could go either way on that, but I would be interested in hearing more.
Okay.
Uh, on the question of reductionism, I think we might have an easy disagreement. I tend to have the view that reductionism is readily uh, argued for, and that the arguments in favor of what I will call strong emergence are incoherent. And so, what I defend is the view that I like to call weak emergence and weak reductionism, which basically is less ambitious than the kind of reductionism that was wanted by Putnam and Oppenheim back in the 1950s, but is still committed to a kind of unity of science, at least at the ontological, if not the theoretical level.
Hmm. Yeah, I think scientists have to be reductionist to do science. That's the essentialism.
Are you serious? I thought you were going to be an irreductionist.
But I ask whenever I have a serious biologist on the program, then I usually end the podcast and say, "Are you a reductionist?"
Mhm.
And I've done this. I've done this at events where I've been at scientific events, and I've been in the company of physicists, and uh, it's my experience so far is 100% of the physicists are reductionists. Okay,
Mm.
but 50% of the biologists are, and 50% are saying, no, no, I think we have to be open to some kind of emergence happened, and we have to
Mhm.
be humble. Um, I like that phrase. Uh, and it's going back to Isaiah Berlin. There are questions we don't know yet, but in order to
Mhm.
come up with them, I do think it's helpful to be essentialist and reductionist.
Oh, that's interesting. That's kind of a mixed view. We should definitely go into that more. Uh, on the question of sexuality, I think we already covered that a little bit, but let me just recapitulate
I'm
by
a
saying,
reductionist.
yeah, I would like to see sexuality.
That's a joke. That's a joke.
Oh, okay. Uh, is that like a particular kind of sexual proclivity or orientation to reduce one another? Sounds kinky. My view is that sexuality is best understood biologically, but that one becomes uh, club-footed, I think, not to engage with the constructivist psychological, sociological, and and uh, and political dimensions of sexuality. So I think
Mm,
there's a lot to be said there, because the fascinating thing about sex is that it brings together all the different fields, all the different areas of philosophy. From physicalism by way of biology, I guess, to mind, society, and politics.
Hmm.
And so it forces you to take positions on everything to have anything with coherence worth saying.
Yeah,
Uh,
I've kind of waffled back and forth on this topic. And it's
mhm,
been very personal to me, as a gay
of
person,
course, of
um,
course, yeah,
where you're outside the norm.
right, right. Well, I'm outside the norm too, but we won't talk about that. And then there's
That's going to be a fun show. So what you're doing
and
now, you're kind of poking around and finding places where we disagree. Um,
I'm not being very
as
successful here. I mean, we seem to
as
agree a little more than I
no,
expected.
no, no. I'll play a non-reductionist, absolutely.
Okay,
Um,
okay, all right. And you've got the
but
social
that's what you're
constructivist
doing,
angle as
right? To
well.
find places
Yes,
where we can pursue.
yes. With respect to liberalism, I wonder how you feel about that. I generally consider myself both anti-ideological and liberal in recognition that liberalism is an ideology. So, to the extent that I'm a liberal, I'm a reluctant liberal, which is to say that one day I discovered that not everybody's a liberal and I'm one of the liberals. But
Hmm.
to that very same extent that I've discovered that I seem to have a kind of ideology, it now leaves a sour taste in my mouth and I want to disassociate. But I can't completely disassociate because I recognize that it's foundational to, the world that we live in. And by world, I mean our country and others like it, not the whole world.
Hmm.
But at the same time, liberalism is being deeply challenged and is ever threatened, even in our own sphere. Since the 1940s and maybe more intensively in the last couple of decades. And I think it's worth close examination why it's under threat and whether it's worth defending and what might be its replacement. And we can ask that question politically, as in a contest of ideologies, which I would rather not do, or we can ask the question philosophically, asking what exactly is it justifies liberalism in the eyes of Mill and his followers, including Berlin and more recently John Gray, and we can ask what might be its failures and what we might learn about political philosophy generally in
That
examination.
yeah, I mean that's beautifully put. I mean, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I mean, everything you
That was
said there
done.
was just
Yeah, it's good.
absolutely
Yeah,
beautifully put, and I'm super curious to learn about you. I mean, on the other topics, but this topic particularly, um, but I think what we're saying here is on these broad topics, liberalism, reductivism, what is science, um, that it would be quite inane to have a position on the broad topic. We have to get into it to tease out the differences, which will be, on the subtopics.
well, I don't think it's entirely inane. I mean, sometimes the opposition really is broad. Like, for example, I'm wholly against social constructivism in a broad, unnuanced way. But when it comes to liberalism,
You are,
if I'm
you are that's one of the crazy things about you.
Mhm, mhm. Well, of course, the crazy one is you, but we'll figure that out later. Uh, but when it comes to liberalism, we have to be nuanced because we are both liberals, even if we are maybe a little bit reluctant about it. Um, we're not so reluctant that we're willing to abandon it, and so you have to go into the nuances to get anything out of it. And similarly, for materialism and physicalism, I think that you and I are both, broadly speaking, materialist physicalists. But then, if you go deeper into it,
I'm not a
maybe we take
materialist physicalist.
anymore. That's right. You did say you abandoned it. What
Yeah.
do you admit into your ontology beyond the material and the physical in your post-materialism?
Numbers, um,
Oh well, okay. But look,
morality.
okay, okay, hold on. Okay, wait. Okay, I of course admit moral truth. Or maybe not, of course, but let me just say it. I do accept moral facts, and I also accept the reality of numbers. The question then is whether that forces a post-materialism or an anti-materialism, or whether it can be accommodated. Here's how
No,
I
I
choose
would
to.
argue it does force that.
Okay, okay. Well, here's how I would accommodate it. First of all, I would abandon the term materialism, except in the context of Aristotle, because I don't think it has very much to do with what we call matter or that which has mass in physics today. So I prefer to say physicalism instead, which is
I see.
inclusive of everything else, time, space, energy, fields, and the like. But even so, that doesn't obviously include either moral facts or numbers. So here's how I would include the numbers. Quite plainly, physics has in its ontology numbers. it may not be. Of course, it's introduced by mathematics,
Hold
but there
on,
is
you
no
blanked
physics
out
without
for a minute there.
mathematics.
Say that again. Say that again.
Okay, okay.
Physics has its ontology numbers.
Physics has in its ontological, among its ontological commitments, the mathematical objects, because there is no physics without mathematics. And
Well,
so,
physics is incredibly problematic itself. You know,
of
I
course it
mean,
is.
my go-to here is Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell, um, where he talks about the metaphysics necessary to do physics
Yes.
in his earliest books, but then in the latest ones, I think one of his final kind of memoirs, I can't remember what it's called, My Life, My Ideas, whatever, history of my philosophy. He really questions the models of physics and points
Okay.
out that they're metaphysical. And I think this leads directly to Putnam, the later Putnam.
Okay. Yeah, that's all fair. But I take that to just to be a conversation among friends, among physicalist friends. You can be a physicalist and still be open to dispute about the finer points of discussion between Russell and Putnam, and I'm perfectly open to that. But what I want to say in broad strokes is that we should not exclude from the physicalist ontology the ontology of mathematics, because mathematics is inherent to physics. There's no physics without math. So that's how I would be inclusive of numbers, even as a physicalist. With respect to moral facts, a different
Well,
argument.
hold on a minute. You just said I include numbers. You don't say why. I mean, we have to get into it, of course, but
No, I did say why. I did say why.
you just say
I
I
said,
include it. That's
well,
all.
I also said why. I include it because there is no physics without mathematics, and so physicalism is the ontology of um, what is what is committed to by the theories of physics.
I
And
see. Okay, I'm
yeah,
following you now. I'm following you now.
okay.
Yeah, I guess you know what I just discovered. I have a view of physicalism that is that it's has to do with the physical world.
Well,
And
yeah, of
you're
course, I agree with
arguing that
that.
no, the
No.
physicalism is just the ontology of physicists, and if they need to use mathematics, then that's part of the
Uh-huh.
ontology.
Well, but I don't disagree with what you said, because the physical world includes mathematics for the very same reasons.
Hmm. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
And then with respect to moral facts, by the way, I recognize that's a unconventional way of accounting for the ontology of mathematics within physicalism. So that's a nuance that I think will be very much open depending on what we read and who we read, et cetera. But that is my view. With respect to moral facts, certainly you're
By
not
the
going to
way,
read off.
I think I talk about materialism more than physicalism, just because there's just so much more literature on materialism.
That's fair, although it's not obvious that they aren't the same meaning in most contexts.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. Um, with respect to moral facts, we certainly can't read off the ontological commitments with respect to morality by reading physics. The physicists don't talk about how things ought to be or what we ought to do. So what it comes down to is the question of reduction. Can moral facts be reduced to physical facts? In other words, is naturalism and metaethics a viable option? It tends to be an unpopular view, an unpopular position, but it is my position. That doesn't mean that I've actually settled on any particular champion of this particular view. Those who are typically associated with it don't impress me very much. And so mostly I consider it a prospective position. That is, I hope that this is something that eventually develops. But for the moment, I just take it as plausible, and I would focus any arguments against I would focus my arguments against a non-naturalism in metaethics. So that's how I can support a physicalism without denying an ontology of either moral facts or numerical or mathematical facts.
I look forward to it.
Yeah, sounds great. And then one final thing, skepticism. I think it's important to talk about skepticism, if for no other reason than that it explains the name of the podcast. The reason I called it the Two Hands Podcast is in reference to G.E. Moore's argument against skepticism of the external world. in which he presents the famous two hands argument. And I'd definitely like to do an episode on that.
Oh, okay. All right. You can introduce me to GE more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's all
I
I've
mean,
got. So
it was he and Bertrand Russell who pushed back against German idealism in British philosophy, and of course, launched the new wave, the new age of British analytical philosophy.
exactly. That's exactly right. So where would you like to start in this large list?
Biology's fun. I mean, we had a lot to say on the biology. By the way, you didn't mention romanticism.
Oh,
But we
yes,
shouldn't start out with romanticism. I mean, we should do a little bit of philosophy first.
that's right. Okay, let's do philosophy of biology, and we'll figure out something offline and then rate it, and then after reading it, we'll begin the discussion again where we left off.
Okay, so what you would like to do is focus on a particular couple of questions, do some reading.
Yeah.
Okay. Super fun. I'm excited.
All right, this is great. I'm very grateful for your commitment and time, and I hope we both learn a lot from each other, and of course from what we read, and of course, and additionally, to anyone who's listening, we will make a point of going through the comments and involving everyone in that conversation.
Oh, that sounds fun.